What's an idea worth? An idea can arise in your head, but if you do nothing with it, it will never come to pass. Today we'll tell you the story of a guy whose perseverance demonstrated that, with enough drive and confidence in one's own talents and abilities, any idea can become a reality. Our story's main character was born on February 24, 1955. His life didn't quite go as planned from the start. His own mother abandoned him when he was a little child and gave him up for adoption. He didn't stay there for very long, though, and before long, he had a new family. Paul and Clara Jobs adopted him. They decided to adopt a child and raise it as their own because they were unable to produce children of their own. Clara and Paul named their adopted son Steve when he joined the family. Surprisingly, Steve was a very gifted boy who had a rare combination of incredible enthusiasm, curiosity, and strong research skills. After some time, Steve was just a regular youngster growing up, but when he was about 12 years old, both his parents and he realized he was captivated by electronics. Even though, as adults, most of us have no idea what these technical words mean, Steve decided to use one day as an opportunity to demonstrate his mettle by expressing a desire to assist his physics teacher in putting together an electric current frequency sensor for the classroom. Even at the time, Steve found the whole thing to be very fascinating. Most of us would have given up at this point due to the lack of necessary tools and components, but Steve came up with an unusual solution. He simply dialed William Hewlett from a phone book, and most of you would have known that the person on the other end of the line was the general director of the well-known company HP. What do you think of that? A 12-year-old boy called someone who could have laughed in his face and ended the conversation without even hearing what the boy had to say. But Steve impressed William. After a 20-minute conversation, William sent over his driver with all the necessary equipment because he found their conversation to be very entertaining. In the late spring, Steve accepted William's personal invitation to an internship at HP while still in high school. He made friends with someone who shared his interests, so they could do what they'd love to do together. Steve Jobs and Wozniak shared an interest in electronics, which allowed them to be persuaded of a product for days on end. When they both finished school, they attended lectures and completed the internship. Later on, Wozniak went to work as an engineer at this corporation. Every person who is passionate about their work and devotes their entire time and energy to it has dreams. Wozniak wanted to build his own personal computer, but Jobs took a different route and decided not to work for the same company, but instead joined Atari as a video game designer. However, the young man's enthusiasm quickly waned, so Steve made the decision to leave and just drop everything instead of choosing the path of enlightenment and traveling to India with his hippie friends. That was the time, he later recalled, when everything felt dull, and I wanted to buy a one-way ticket and leave. The time was right for regeneration and vital for getting brand new original ideas. Jobs stayed in the United States and became one of the pioneers of the Homebrew Computer Club, which was only widely known among radio amateurs, but his efforts were not in vain. The long-awaited project that Wozniak had been working on was finally completed in 1975, and he proudly presented his first personal computer prototype to the company he had worked for during his school years. Unfortunately, and much to Wozniak's great disappointment, things didn't go as planned, and his innovative idea was rejected. Even though Wozniak was quite angry, he persisted and attempted to approach Atari, where his buddy had previously worked as a designer. However, to his even greater sorrow, the firm similarly rejected Wozniak's innovation, viewing it as a non-profitable endeavor. Wozniak himself noted that people always tend to question something new, and my innovation was no exception at the time, has failed due to a simple fear of not having stability that produces cash and tends to reject novel ideas. Steve Wozniak was at a loss because he could no longer work for those companies because he didn't understand the purpose anymore, and his invention, which he spent years building, was being ridiculed. Nobody is certain what would have happened to the dejected and embarrassed Wozniak had the prodigal son not chosen to return from India, although it is obvious that the first thing he did upon his return was to visit his friend, who informed Jobs about his innovation and its failure. That night, after spending a lot of time discussing their alternatives, Jobs bravely suggested that they take their own independent path and start their own business. The two young guys, about whom no one knew much, then made the decision to go on a new course in life, which, as it turned out many years later, was the road to success. Steve was brainstorming possible names for their company. On April 1st, 1976, while at home with his friends, Jobs was interested in an apple diet after returning from India. Thus, he suggested naming the business Apple. Despite how absurd it may sound, some of the first samples of the Apple I were assembled in Steve Jobs' bedroom with only their own hands, imaginations, and a bedroom as their only resources. Where could they sell this miraculous device, though? Apple I outperformed the rival at the very least by having a keyboard for input and a display that showed the results. When they brought their invention to stores, they were met with rejection by everyone, and their first major issue was that no one wanted to buy the unknown product. Only one store agreed to accept their product, but only on the condition that they would be paid if it sold. To everyone's surprise, the novel device quickly sold out. When they realized there wasn't enough space for them to increase production, they made the decision to move into Jobs' garage, where the Apple I computer, which sold for $666.66, was then produced. Jobs was in response to all the sales-related concerns, but this figure wasn't decided by accident. It was Wozniak's idea. The first 100 computers were sold to local customers, contributing somewhat to Apple's initial budget. But new funds were required for the company to expand and increase production, and Jobs took on this task as well because Wozniak and the team were primarily focused on the project's production and technical aspects, while Jobs was in charge of all financial matters and marketing efforts. There were times when Jobs was prepared to abandon the project altogether. The company's budget was increased by $92,000, and then by an additional $250,000 through a credit line at Bank of America. At one point when Steve Jobs even stopped talking to people and refused to leave his room for days while calling banks in search of funding, but they all rejected his request. However, when there was almost no hope left, Steve did manage to find the right person who invested in the project. Each team member was happy with their progress, as they could see their success improving. Wozniak could finally pursue his passion, and Jobs were incredibly proud of the development and application of each of their ideas. The updated variant, known as Apple II, debuted in 1980 and featured color graphics. Wozniak also added the file system, the simplest DOS, and the Disk 2 controller. It goes without saying that the brand new Apple II made an impression. It was this model that helped the company and its owners make millions, and finally paved the way for the company to list on the American Stock Exchange. However, life is unpredictable, and for every success, there's a setback. The development of new products had to be put on hold while Wozniak underwent 2 years of rehabilitation after his plane crashed during takeoff in 1981. The problem was that Wozniak had amnesia and couldn't recall anything about his previous activities. So Jobs decided not to rush back to work after the incident, and instead took his time to study under a false name. However, in 1983, he returned to the company where he had been working. Jobs recruited a rival into the organization, who, in addition to having different management ideas, also took the initiative to get Jobs fired in 1985 by the board of directors. After Jobs left the company, things were still going well for a while because they had Steve's remaining innovations. Over the next 12 years, they developed and promoted their own operating system, which allowed them to survive. A serious problem for the company was the rapid decline in the value of the shares. People even argued about which of the current market giants would acquire the remains of the well-known company. Meanwhile, Steve didn't waste time either. He directed all of his efforts on promoting his new brainchild, the Next company. It was for this purpose that Jobs worked on developing his own operating system and creating a computer for scientific purposes. You'll be surprised. But the famous Pixar was also under Jobs' management at the time, and that's when the studio released such hits like Toy Story and Monsters Incorporated. As a result of Steve's efforts and effective top management, the company reached previously unheard-of heights. On December 20, 1996, Apple decided to purchase Next for $429 million, an astounding sum. But they came with one stipulation: Jobs would be restored to the organization. As the CEO, Jobs oversaw the firing of numerous employees and the discarding of outmoded developments. Jobs couldn't help but reflect on the fact that he might not have been as successful had he not been fired. The first iMac was released on August 15, 1998, and shortly after that, the renowned OS X was developed. A year later, the world was introduced to the iBook, which shared the iMac's design. Looking back on it now, it may seem strange, but it was the top product back then. It was a very significant experience that helped Jobs understand what he needed to do to succeed. The launch of the first iPod and the opening of the first Apple stores in 2001 marked a turning point for the company in the music industry. The iPod quickly rose to the top of the sales charts thanks to its user-friendly design, convenient size, and simple operation. In 2008, the world was presented to the MacBook Air, a laptop that was incredibly thin, light and self-sufficient with the toughest case, and the well-known hinge that allowed one-finger laptop lid opening. Steve didn't want to stop there, so in 2010 he unveiled the original iPad. The business was named the most costly in the world in August 2011. Because of this success, Steve was able to publicly announce his resignation because he had achieved everything he had ever wanted. Jobs then gave Tim Cook the position of chairman of the board of directors, and Apple is now the market leader on every continent. Steve Jobs, in his creation Apple, demonstrated to the world that nothing is impossible, and no matter how difficult and thorny the path is, if you give in fully to your dream, you will succeed. In just one quarter of 2019, Apple's revenue was $64 billion, and there is hardly anyone on the planet who does not know this brand. Jobs was given the news that he had pancreatic cancer in 2003, but he continued to spend the majority of his time on his favorite projects while being ill. According to his family, Steve Jobs passed away quietly at his home in California at around 3 p.m. on August 5, 2011, from respiratory failure. He was surrounded by the people he loved most, his wife, children, and sisters, and his last words were, "Oh, wow." After hearing this man's story, it's hard to believe that Steve Jobs, a regular guy, could have become a public speaking legend and the generation's greatest genius. However, every brilliant idea first enters someone's mind, and it is up to that person to decide what to do with it and how to make their dreams come true. Friends, please share your opinions regarding this individual and his idea in the comments section below.